Thank you for joining us on From the Lectern. This is Walter Strickland. We're on the campus of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm here with Dr. Michael Bird, who's becoming a good friend. I hope over time, I can say that without.
I think we are good friends.
Okay.
You haven't had me over your house for ribs yet, but I think we're good friends now.
Okay.
We're good friends now.
Okay. He's currently staying here as a visiting scholar for a short time, and hopefully we can have some ribs, and so I can actually go into a conference and quote you as my good friend Mike Bird, who is a lecturer at Ridley College in Australia, and grateful to have you here on campus with us.
I am so grateful to be here. I've been having a wonderful time meeting great people like you and so many others.
Yeah, and so last Tuesday we had a symposium, with yourself and our provost, Dr. Bruce Ashford, talking about the Benedict option.
Yep.
One of the implications of that conversation that came up multiple times was to listen to voices that we often historically haven't listened to in the Theological Academy. And one of those that continue to come out, which is actually appropriate because the event was sponsored by the Society for Women in Scholarship, was for scholars to listen to more women.
Yep.
And so I just wanted to engage that a little bit more. Why is it important that we do that? Which women have influenced you the most as a resource for our listeners to sort of look to hear from? And then also just take us down that path a little bit.
Okay, I think we need to listen to women voices because I'm not good at math, but one thing I've noticed, women make up about half of the church. Now, again, I wasn't a maths major, but, and most of us are related to women some way, often by birth or marriage. Mm-hmm. Well, in Boston, it might be a bit different. I mean, you can relate to women in all sorts of different ways in Boston. So I think that's, at the very least, that's important. That has a number of consequences. In the very least, within the church, we do have to listen to women. One thing that we've been discovering in Australia is that on the issue of domestic violence, women's voices in churches have not been heard. And that has had catastrophic effects within the church. And there's been a number of news stories, a bit of really good journalism that's been going on talking about what happened when you don't listen to voices, or where the only people available to listen are other men. Like if a woman complains about domestic violence, either about the pastor or her husband, she's got to explain it to a panel of 6 other guys. Mm-hmm. And there's always the danger it can be taken of just the old boys network kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. So we need forums where women's issues are heard and various things, but also what women can contribute to scholarship, the academy, and the life of the church. And if you read the New Testament, there's many prominent women who are involved in there. Just read Romans 16 or look at who was at the empty tomb and things like that. And I mean, there's been a number of great scholars around I've really liked. One of my favorites is Professor Lynn Cohick of Wheaton College. Mm-hmm. She's something, I don't know what I'd call her, like Aunt Lynn. I don't know if Lynn's watching. But she is a wonderful Christian scholar who also happens to be a woman, and I've got to work with Lynn in numerous contexts on numerous projects, and she's been fantastic. And I mean, her stuff about women in the ancient church is terrific, and some of her biblical commentaries as well. At my college as well now, we try to get our PhD students to read the biographies either from or about various scholars, and the one that we've been driving students to read is the biography of Elizabeth Achtermeyer. Okay. So that's one available, and she's got her own particular story. And she was a Old Testament scholar, largely within PCUSA context. Okay. But given that denomination, we'd call her fairly orthodox by those standards. And she's got a great story and what she contributed. And there's so many female scholars around. I mean, certainly on top of my head, I can think of people like Beverly Gaventa, a very credible and preeminent female scholar working largely in Pauline studies. And even at times where I don't agree with her on everything, and I certainly don't, I always find her works very illuminating and very judicious. Mm-hmm. And I think it's those sorts of voices at all levels of the church, in the academy and scholarship. If we just blind ourselves to them, we're going to be creating our own ignorance, and we're only operating on half the strength of the church.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. And so I really appreciate how you just jump right into an issue as important as domestic violence. So in the church, how would you encourage us to move forward in hearing those voices better, because it's a friend of mine who is a psychologist. He recently told me that he's heard multiple, and he works with the police officers and what have you, social services in the state of North Carolina. He says that of the thousands of cases and accusations of domestic violence, there's only been maybe a handful that have been false.
Yep.
And so if somebody comes forward, it's usually a positive affirmation of this is actually happening.
Yeah.
And so, and even to the degree of, if we look at the Matthew 18 paradigm, treating that as the first interaction, treating that as the first step of going to that person, and then, because they've already done that, I'm sure, and then they are now coming to leaders of the church to begin further steps.
Yep.
And so, like, how would you suggest that we take that issue, but then also learning from and appropriating the voices of women in the church context?
Okay, well, there's a number of things. On the domestic violence thing, I mean, that's going to vary from church context to church context. But I think for what would be paramount is that if a woman does say that she and her children are victims of domestic violence, that she's not attacked or ridiculed or has to go before a panel of 3 or 4 men to justify why she's left her husband or this sorts of things. And you need to have mechanisms within leadership, regardless of whether that's Baptist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, whatever. You need to have mechanisms where women can speak, can share, can receive protection, when something like this is going on. And now that's going to vary from church to church, and like if you're an elder-led church or a deacon-led church, or you've got like a wardens and Anglican church, you need to have some sort of point of contact who can there provide independent advice and offer protection to someone who's in that situation. Again, you have to discern that within the precincts of your own ecclesiastical conscience, how you do that within your leadership. But you've got to make sure that there is no punitive consequence against women for saying that they are victims of domestic violence. So that would be paramount. As to how we appropriate the voices of women in academia more, well, there's a number of things you can do. At my college at Ridley in Melbourne, we've started an annual conference about women in academia. And we thought we'd get maybe 10 or 20 women interested. We got in our first time it was run, we got over 100 people running it, and it's run very well. We've got people at my college like Dr. Jill Firth. She now is the main convener of that conference. And I mean, we ran several conferences last year. The Women in Academia was the big one.
Wow.
That we did a conference on Martin Luther. We had 50 or 60 people. Women in Academia, we got 110 or 120 or something ridiculous.
That's fantastic.
So, I mean, there is an appetite for that. And it's not just about women, wanting to be pastors or professors. Women who just want to, go on and do graduate work. Do they want to have writing ministries? Do they want to have speaking ministries? And, we got very diverse people across the theological and denominational spectrum coming along because they were just hungry and they had an appetite to learn, what opportunities do I have here? What gifts, what things can I contribute to church, academy, and ministry? And so little things like that, or just encouraging, women, the best and brightest of men and women to go into grad school and, supporting them in that way. I know some of the initiatives you have here at Southeastern, the Society for Women. I mean, initiatives like that, I think will sow seeds that will give us a harvest of fruit later down the track. And you may have another Lynn Cohick in your ranks, or another Beverly Gaventa, or whoever it is we want to talk about. You may have another one here right now.
And I think we do have a couple that I'm excited about, and that I've had in my class. That I've, and I use them as the exemplary papers to, with their permission, to hand out to other students. So some of you guys might be thinking, okay, you are 2 men having a conversation about the validity of women in scholarship. I don't think that's inappropriate. I think it's actually very appropriate.
I mean, on the one level, I can understand what you might refer to the asymmetry of it.
That's true. That's true.
Two men speaking about women and their inclusion, and obviously, I think we both recognise this is any conversation about women should always include women. I think we're fair at that. But the fact is, men need to discuss amongst themselves how do we better empower and equip women to the things which God has called them. And I think it's okay for us blokes as we'd say in Strauss, blokes, to discuss that sort of thing.
And I would affirm that even further by saying it's incumbent upon us to proactively invite those voices into the theological and biblical conversation, because we can go on and be considered reputable scholars without having had to interact with women's scholarship or the scholarship that's produced by women. I mean, at least in some environments, in some of the more conservative environments.
I was going to say, well, in most environments I hang out, if you don't have any women in your bibliography, although that said, some of my female students have pushed me about the number of women I have in the bibliographies that I have signed. And a couple of students have said, well, it's pretty testosterone thick here, Mike. Not a lot of women here, and well, in some disciplines, there may not be a prominent number of women of others. But I remember I taught a course on Romans, and my top 10 Romans commentaries were all largely male. And so I thought about what some of the voices I could bring out, and I did know of some great works on Romans, like Fleming Rutledge. He's got a great series of sermons on Romans. So when I got some pastors to read like 3 books of sermons on Romans, I think I got Tim Keller's book was like one, and Fleming Rutledge's was the second one, and there's a few others. Beverly LaVenta just brought a great book out on Romans called When in Romans, which is her own sort of studies on Romans as well. And so I have been a little bit more conscious out of that deliberate prodding by students to think, well, how can I be more inclusive, be more representative in women, not just in the people I cite in my own books, but even the type of things I'm exposing students to. Because I don't want my students to read just male redhead Anglican scholars. Brilliant though they may be,
yes,
they are few and far between, and so I want them to read across the theological spectrum. I want them to hear different voices from the global south, a lot of voices from North America and Europe, and even from our own Australia. And I think a really healthy reading list. You'll recommend the best works on something, but I think you've got to think, what kind of learning experiences can I enhance in students by getting them to read broadly.
Yeah, and I've actually benefited greatly from the types of questions. I mean, as a theologian, there's different sets of driving forces and questions that sort of make scholarship arise.
Yes.
And so even having to grapple with those questions have broadened my students' ability to engage in scholastic dialogue.
And it's just so important to think, is there another way of reading Scripture? What is it like to read the book of James through the eyes of the majority world? What's it like to read something like Galatians in the context of Sri Lanka, in a country that is ethnically divided between different groups? And that those things, I think, are huge resources you can access, and they can change your way when you realize. A lot of Christians, I think, suffer from hermeneutical solipsism. They assume that their interpretation is the only one that exists, or the only valid one. Yeah. But when you realize that there are insights you can get from different cultures, and even just from people in general, that their own life experience will bring something to the table. Now, I would say a variety of interpretations does not mean validity.
Exactly.
I don't think in the diversity each interpretation is valid, and we can evaluate different interpretations on things like canonicity, Catholicity, and coherence, and reception history, and all that. So I don't think it's all interpretations are equal, but I think we do need to be prepared to accept that our way, the Anglican way, the Presbyterian way, the male way, the white male way, the Northern Hemisphere way, or whatever the way is you've been ingrained, is not the only way, and you can learn a lot and at least appreciate the people who are other, who are different to you. And that's in the global Church of Christ, that is what we should be doing.
And I think oftentimes people assume that their particular interpretation is as inspired as the text is.
Yeah, there is. If there is a danger to conservatism, it's the danger of preaching the inerrancy of the text but practicing the inerrancy of your interpretation.
Exactly.
And not understanding that there is a difference between text and hermeneutic, and the propensity is to project one into the other. Now, you can have a biblical text that is authoritative, it is sufficient, it is infallible, or whatever designations we want to use, but when you project your own interpretation or your own tradition into that, I mean, that is really dangerous. To be honest, it's a recipe of going from a church to a cult.
It is.
It is very dangerous, and that's why everyone needs a little bit of hermeneutical self-reflection. Okay, what is the text saying? What am I trying to say in or with the text, and how do I separate myself? Or how do I at least recognize the historical, traditional, and cultural factors that have shaped my interpretation?
Exactly.
At the very least, recognizing my own situatedness, I think, is very important.
Yeah. We are so particular, and those particularities do drive our interpretation, which is, as you said, is not infallible. So, or yeah, is fallible. Sorry, which is. Anyway, so we've talked about we're just hitting a bunch of issues, but I would like to talk about some distinctions between America and Australia.
Yep. Vegemite.
Vegemite, yes. I did have Vegemite once.
Yeah.
And I think it will be once, even 20 years down the road. But Vegemite, even the smell of Vegemite, I don't know. I just don't know how you do it. Do you eat Vegemite?
Yeah, I do. It took me about 25 years to be able to eat it.
Okay.
But through gradual exposure to it, I was able to, and I like it. In fact, my typical Sunday morning breakfast is Vegemite and avocado on toast. I
do like avocado and toast, but I'd probably go without the Vegemite if you had me over to your house. So, but that's that's okay. Oh man. Anyway. We digress. That is important. That is important, though, the Vegemite. So, in America, especially now, we're having lots of conversations about ethnicity and race and immigration. And I mean, the conversation, DACA and Dreamers is just in our faces right now. And we aren't the only country who's grappling with these issues.
Yep.
So if you could, as you've been here for a little bit and watching from across the ocean, what issues sort of mirror in Australia, but then how are you guys working through them perhaps differently?
Okay, well, let me pick three areas. First one of the continuing legacies, in some way it's a legacy of shame we have to deal with, is how we deal with the Indigenous Australians, largely Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, our own people. And Australia's, what the colonial Australia's response to them has been ranged from genocide, or at least attempted genocide, segregation, and all sorts of other abuses, whole generations of children taken from their parents, that type of a thing. And there was a real big political statement called the Uluru Statement made earlier this year, where the Indigenous leaders in our country campaigned for some sort of recognition, not just in our constitution, but some sort of representation to the Parliament. Not necessarily like having a further Congress or a Senate or some sort of addition. We can remain a bicameral, bi-parliamentarian system, but they wanted some representative body to represent their interests. And it's been really sad how that's been kind of ridiculed or attacked or simply ignored by our political leaders. And so I think what the Australia's First Peoples are asking for is not great. It's mere recognition and representation. Just not just having some formal place where they can represent their views to the Australian Parliament. And it's been sad to see that being ridiculed and rejected. So that's one set of issues. We still have the legacy of the shame, and we still talk about reconciliation in Australia. And with great progress, I believe, has been made since the 1960s, where we first started counting Indigenous Australians in our census to giving them the right to vote, which is fairly late, but we've still got so much progress to do. So that's one issue as well. The second issue is we do have a problem with immigration. Given all the turmoil in the Middle East and other parts, we have had in the past a large number of boatloads of refugees coming to Australia. Sadly, a lot of these boats sink and people die, and it's sort of bound up with people smuggling. Are these people refugees? Are they just economic migrants? But at the moment, both of our parliaments, of the centre left and centre right, their policy has been to take these refugees who come by boat and stick them in indefinite detention in different countries, either in Papua New Guinea or on the island of Nauru, which is a Pacific island. And these people have been told they will never be settled in Australia, And that if they can prove their refugee status, they can be settled somewhere else. I think the United States has taken some of these refugees under a refugee agreement with the Obama administration. Many of these have been offered to go to Cambodia and have refuge there, or they could be settled in Papua New Guinea. And I recognise it's not a black and white issue, but I mean, I've got to tell you something. I'm a conservative. I am so conservative. I took the left-hand indicator off my car. I can only drive right. I mean, to drive from Raleigh to Wake Forest, I had to go via Charlotte to get here. It was terrible. It was terrible. And I'm also a patriot. You know, I served in the military, and in the Australian context, I'd say I've got red hair and I'm from Queensland, which in our context, that just means you're a conservative. Yeah. But a conservative if I am, a patriot as I am, locking up refugee children behind barbed wire is not Australian. I mean, you know, as a soldier, I was prepared to fight, die, and kill for our freedom, our way of life. When I think of the things I was prepared to die for and kill for, locking up children, refugees behind barbed wire, was really not one of them. So I'm kind of appalled about our refugee policy in Australia. Now, I recognise it is complex. We don't want people, you know, dying at sea. We don't want, you know, people smugglers operating. But, you know, as Charles Spurgeon said, you know, when faced with two evils, rather than choose the lesser one, choose neither. I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to find another way. And yes, we need to have immigration security and everything, but I mean, in Australian language, we'd call this, you know, a policy of basically a deterrent by bastardry. That's what we'd say in Australia. That would be the Australian language we would use. That's basically, you know, being a bastard to refugees is our main deterrent. And, you know, and that's not Christian. I think it's got to stop. The third issue I'll point out is that it's becoming clear in Australia that there are significant differences in terms of values between our immigrant communities and what you might call the cultural elites, particularly sort of the progressive inner city type people. And this became very clear in Australia. We had a national postal survey on same-sex marriage, about whether we would legalise same-sex marriage. And it was quite a vicious campaign. I think both sides, there were some real, some extreme elements on both sides, at least a whole lot of nasty.
Yeah.
And one thing that came out though, I mean, the vote was yes for about 61% yes, 39% no. But in Sydney, in Western Sydney, there was a whole stream of electorates that voted no, and quite overwhelmingly as well. And these are areas that have high rates of Middle Eastern and Asian immigration. So you're looking at people from, you know, Lebanon, Hong Kong, Malaysia, you know, South India, and places like that. And I'm worried in Australia that the political left in our country, who has normally prided themselves on inclusion and diversity, I worry that they're about to discover their inner xenophobe, their inner Islamophobe. Because if I've noticed anything, it's that these people, the sort of the political elites, the sort of political left, are very happy to have brown-skinned people in the photos with them. But they don't like hearing them speak because they find out that their views of family and marriage and sexuality are actually quite conservative. And there was one nasty incident that got videoed where there was a couple, I think from like India, and there was this college student who was harassing them, and he said to them, "How dare you come to our country and vote no on same-sex marriage?" I mean, you can say, "How dare you come to our country and vote no?" And that is to say, you know, certain immigrants very welcome to be seen as long as they're not heard, and so I mean you can see that on YouTube, and that's what I'm worried about for our immigrant communities. That there is a kind of like alt-right in Australia that's very anti-immigrant, that's very anti, you know, Muslim as well, and I see almost full circle the political left. I suspect is going to join them now, and it's going to be a really weird alliance between like the alt-right and the far left when it comes to how they treat immigrant communities, because one view is xenophobic, and the opposite side, the political left, really have a lot of animus, or sorry, a lot of animosity against immigrant communities because of their conservative cultural beliefs. So I think we are set for a very perfect, albeit ugly storm in Australia when it comes to immigration.
So as far as you're thinking about immigration as a biblical scholar, as a biblical theologian.
I'm an immigrant as well.
Oh, really?
I am an immigrant. I keep forgetting because I'm white. I say that tongue in cheek. What I mean by that is I'm never made to feel like an immigrant in Australia.
I see.
So that's what I mean by it. I mean, no one makes me feel like I'm an immigrant. Or no one says to me, well, hey, why did you come here and not speak our language properly? Or you're taking all our jobs, or marrying all our women, or stuff like that. I don't get that because I've got a sort of British descent.
Yeah. Wow. So you are quite the perfect storm.
Yeah. Wow.
You're in the military. You're an immigrant. You're just and the list continues to go on.
Yeah.
As a person who's a biblical theologian.
Yeah.
How does your reading of Scripture inform your thoughts on immigration?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, I know a lot of other people have thought long and hard about this. I've got lots of friends who are immigration activists, who have tried to do, who are working continuously and laboriously to close down these places like Manus Island and Nauru, working tirelessly and great cost, and I've got a great respect for them. I do like to nuance this discussion, saying I understand that Australians can decide who comes to their country, and we don't want people dying at sea. So I mean, I fully understand the complexity, but I think at the very least, we have enough room and resources to be very compassionate on this. And I think, I mean, Jesus was a refugee. I mean, his family took him down to Egypt to get away from King Herod. And the Bible's got a lot about how you treat the alien and the sojourner, and nowhere does it say thou shalt lock them up behind barbed wire, including their children. And and so I think in the very least we need to take those things to heart and not choose the lesser of the two evils, but choose what is right, what is holy, what is the justice that flows down like a river. That's what I think we need to do. Now, how you make that policy with all the complexities in the geopolitical context of our day and age, and I know you've got similar issues in Europe with seeing refugees and mass immigration makes certain people nervous, and it does affect the culture of a place. But above all, I think our rule has to be compassion. I mean that's not me just picking and choosing. I'm not a cafeteria Catholic or a buffet Baptist just picking and choosing the bits of the Bible I want to take into account. There's a lot in the Bible about how you treat people in that sense of vulnerability. And ultimately, we will be judged and held account to how we do it. Our government, our churches, and again, let me say, I'm not advocating a kind of complete open borders policy. We do need to have immigration. We need to have security. There are some people who you should not let into your country. So I'm not some ultra left-wing tree-hugging feminazi from Berkeley with a PhD in postmodern French feminism and Derrida hermeneutics. Okay, so just so you're hearing me right. But I think compassion should be the norm rather than the exception.
And I would even say that I agree wholeheartedly for the American context. There's been especially amongst those who call themselves evangelical Christians, to even having the conversation, there's a hardness there that I think is unbiblical. I'll affirm that I'm not saying, hey, we should just open up the borders. Let's just let anybody come in. But at the same time, there should be a certain Christ-like candor to our conversation that I think is not there. And then, which I think then has probably eliminated the possibility of arising at a conclusion on the matter that could be long-term, a long-term solution and viable for the foreseeable future. And so I just wanted to thank you for just even jumping into those waters that are so choppy. I know.
It is, and I think we can acknowledge it's not a black and white issue. There are complexities and nuances that need to be made, but there are some policies and some stances that do in practice become very inhumane. And as Christians, I think we should stand up against them, because that's what I think the Lord Jesus taught, and that's what we find in the testimony of Scripture.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much for sitting here with us. Our time has marched on very quickly, so we have basically given you the tools to ruin any good dinner. We talked about gender, we've talked about immigration, we've talked about race, we've talked about and
importantly, Vegemite,
which will actually ruin your toast.
It will ruin the toast. Well, I mean, it's like axle grease with salt. Explain it that way. Go out. Application for today. Go out and have some Vegemite.
If you can find it. I think World Market has Vegemite.
Yeah.
So if you're in America, you're listening to us, go to World Market, buy a very small thing of Vegemite because that's all you'll need.
Yeah, put it on like peanut butter. No, don't. That's enough to kill a horse. Don't do that.
Yeah, it would kill a horse. But anyhow, thanks for listening. Grateful for you out there. For more information about Kingdom Diversity at Southeastern Seminary, you can go to kingdomdiversity.sebts.edu. Follow us on Twitter at K_diversity. For more information about Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and the College at Southeastern, you can go to scbts.edu. Grace and peace.